"You're too sick to stay here anymore." The words hit like a slap, echoing off the walls of my own dining room. I was 58, sitting at the head of a Thanksgiving table I'd set since my 20s, the same oak surface polished every year until it shone under the chandelier. My son sat across from me, his wife beside him, both smiling the way people do when they've already made up their minds. For a moment, no one spoke. Forks hovered, wine glasses froze midair. I stared at the cranberry sauce, thinking if I kept my eyes on it, maybe I'd misheard. But when I looked up, my daughter-in-law's smile stayed firm. "We've talked about it," she said softly. "And it's for your health, Mom. You need care, real care." The room was warm. The smell of roasted turkey, gravy thick in the air, cinnamon candles burning near the counter. My grandson laughed at something on his tablet. The sound barely reached me. Every face blurred behind heat and shame. The glow that once meant home now felt like an interrogation light. I'd spent 3 days cooking this meal. I'd spent 30 years making sure this family never felt hunger, never saw a late bill, never lost a roof. The mortgage, the taxes, the endless quiet payments, all mine. But no one looked at me now. They looked at each other, waiting for me to accept it, waiting for me to nod, smile, and fade away. "Too sick," I repeated, hearing my own voice crack. "Since when does a little arthritis mean exile?" "Don't do this," my son whispered. "We just think—" "You think I'm an inconvenience," I said. The sentence came out steadier than I felt. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Please, not in front of everyone." It was always that. Appearances first, truth later, if ever. My daughter-in-law reached for his hand, a small gesture that told the room where loyalty lived now. Across the table, my niece dropped her eyes to her plate. The others followed. Silence spread faster than gossip ever could. Outside the window, the sun had just slipped behind the trees, the sky turning that dull gray of early evening. I'd cooked since dawn, paying for every dish, every spice, even the flowers in the vase. $48, I remembered, because the florist had been so cheerful counting change. Now the flowers looked stiff, too bright for the mood. Someone cleared a throat. Someone else reached for the gravy boat. The normal rhythm tried to return, but it couldn't. I stood up, slowly, feeling every year in my bones. "If I'm too sick to stay," I said, "then I'll save you the trouble of asking twice." My chair scraped against the tile. The sound broke the hush. My daughter-in-law started to say something, but my son stopped her with a look. The moment sealed itself, like a photograph you can't tear without remembering. I walked to the hallway, picked up the keys from the bowl near the door, the ones I used to hand to him when he borrowed my car. They jingled faintly in my palm, cold against skin still warm from the oven's heat. That sound would follow me later, in dreams and in anger. I wanted to turn back, to remind them that everything in that house existed because I'd built it. The walls, the savings, even the second mortgage I'd paid off when he lost his job 5 years ago. But no one would hear it now. Gratitude dies quietly when comfort takes its place. At the door, I looked once more at the table. My grandson laughed again, unaware of the storm sitting inches away from him. My daughter-in-law cut a slice of pie, cheerful, practiced, already moving on. My son poured himself another drink, his face blank. The air smelled of butter and smoke. The heat from the kitchen brushed my back as I stepped into the hallway. For a second, I thought maybe someone would call out, "Wait," or "Don't go," or even, "We didn't mean it." But the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the murmur of small talk trying to rebuild itself over the wreckage. I opened the front door. Cold air rushed in, sharp and real. I felt it in my lungs, clear as truth. Behind me, laughter rose again. Awkward, forced, but laughter still. I stepped outside, clutching the keys like proof of existence. The porch light flickered once, weak and yellow, before steadying. I walked down the steps without looking back. For years, I'd thought love meant patience, that family meant forgiveness without question. That belief cracked tonight, clean through the middle. As I reached the sidewalk, I could still hear the clinking of plates behind me, each sound a reminder that I'd been erased in plain sight. The night smelled faintly of pine and smoke from the neighbor's fireplace. My breath clouded in the cold. I thought about all the meals, all the years, all the quiet sacrifices traded for a moment like this, public dismissal disguised as concern. I realized I was now a guest in my own home. I packed what I could carry. The sound of the zipper closing felt louder than it should have. It was past midnight when I left, the house behind me still glowing in the kitchen window. My breath made small clouds in the cold air. I was 58, and for the first time in decades, I had nowhere to go that felt like home. The keys hung from my wrist, heavy, familiar. They used to mean belonging. Now they only meant what I'd lost. By the time I reached the motel on Maple Street, the clock behind the counter showed 12:45 a.m. The young man at the desk didn't look up much, just mumbled the rate, $72 for the night. I slid the bills across, money that once went toward groceries or light bills or birthday cakes for them. My hands shook as I signed the slip. He gave me a room key that barely turned in the lock. Inside, the air smelled like disinfectant and old fabric. I sat on the bed and stared at the half-empty pill bottles in my bag. My joints ached from lifting the suitcase, but I didn't dare complain to myself. Pain felt safer than pity. I pulled out a sweater, the one my husband had given me the year before he died. It still held a trace of him. That small comfort burned more than it soothed. When dawn came, I walked to the small diner next to the motel. The window fogged up from the steam of coffee pots. I had only enough cash for a single breakfast, toast, eggs, and a refill I stretched across 2 hours. Around me, truckers talked about weather and bills. Normal talk. The kind you don't realize you miss until you're no longer part of it. I took out my notebook and wrote the total I had left. A little under $2,200 in checking, some old savings, and the pension my son had insisted on helping manage. That word, help, felt cruel now. Every dollar had become a quiet reminder of how control disappears one signature at a time. By mid-morning, I walked back to my street. The neighbor's porch light was still on, though it was nearly 9 a.m. Nancy saw me before I reached her gate. She hurried out, coat half-zipped. "I heard what happened," she said. Her voice trembled. "He told people he's finally taking charge of things." I laughed without humor. "Taking charge," I repeated. "That's what he calls it." She looked around before pressing something into my hand, my spare keys. "Keep them," she whispered. "He said you'd given them up." The metal felt cold against my palm, grounding. I didn't realize how much I'd missed that weight until I felt it again. "Thank you," I said. It was the kind of thank you that carried exhaustion instead of gratitude. Nancy glanced at the house across the street. "You should come inside. Have some tea." "I can't stay long," I said. "I just needed to see it." From her porch, I could see my own front window, curtains drawn. My daughter-in-law's car parked outside. It looked like they belonged there now. The thought made me dizzy, like standing too close to a cliff. "I thought they loved me," I said quietly. "I raised him alone. I worked 2 jobs so he could go to college. I sold my wedding ring once to cover tuition." Nancy reached for my hand. "Some children forget the cost of their comfort." Her words stayed with me long after I left. I walked back to the motel around noon, passing the bank where I'd deposited every paycheck for 30 years. Through the glass doors, I could see the same teller who used to smile at me every Friday. I didn't go in. I wasn't ready to see how quickly stories change when money gets involved. Back in the room, I opened the curtains and watched sunlight fill the space. The smell of bleach and detergent drifted through again, faint but steady. I unpacked my bag slowly, folding what little I had. Shirts, a photo frame, a stack of mail, and the small jar of coins I'd kept on the kitchen counter for emergencies. I realized this was that emergency. At 2 p.m., I called the pharmacy to transfer my prescriptions. The woman on the phone hesitated when she recognized my address. "Your son already called about those," she said. "He said he's taking care of your medications now." I gripped the phone tighter. "Don't transfer anything," I said. "I'll come in myself." The silence on the line stretched. Then she said, "Of course, ma'am," and hung up. That small exchange told me everything. Control wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about my life, piece by piece. If I didn't stop them soon, I'd vanish completely into their version of me. Weak, dependent, replaceable. That night, I sat under the dim motel lamp and wrote a list of what I still had left. Assets, documents, people I could trust. It wasn't long. Nancy's name was at the top. The neighbor who handed me keys had unknowingly handed me something more important, the reminder that I wasn't powerless. When I turned off the lamp, the room went dark, except for the faint blue glow of the porch light outside. It flickered once, like a small signal in the distance, and I felt something stir inside me. If they wanted me gone, they'd regret how cleanly I left. They came banging on my door. It was noon, a week after I'd left, when the pounding started. The sound rattled the thin walls of the motel like a warning. I froze halfway through folding my sweater. I knew that rhythm. Impatient, entitled. When I peered through the window, my son was standing there, fists clenched, his wife beside him with her arms folded tight. Their car was still running at the curb, exhaust spilling into the quiet street. I opened the door just enough to be seen. "What do you want?" He stepped forward. "The house," he said. "It belongs to us now." My pulse spiked. "No, it doesn't." "It does," he snapped. "I've got the papers." That word again. Papers. So thin, so final. My grip tightened on the edge of the door. "You mean the ones I paid off with my savings? The ones with my name on them?" He smirked. "You'll see soon enough." His wife shifted her purse higher on her shoulder. "We're done arguing. Either give us the keys or deal with the sheriff." Her voice was calm, rehearsed, the tone people use when they think they've already won. "I don't take orders from you," I said. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Don't make this worse, Mom. You're not thinking straight anymore. It's time to let go." Something in me hardened. I closed the door slowly until the latch clicked. He shouted through the wood, "You'll regret this!" I waited until the sound of their car faded before I exhaled. My hands were trembling. For a long minute, I just stood there listening to the silence afterward. It wasn't peace. It was disbelief. I went to the desk drawer where I kept the deed, the life insurance papers, and a copy of the final mortgage payment. The folder was gone. Only an envelope from the water company lay in its place. My stomach sank. I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty drawer. The documents were proof of everything I'd built. 30 years of work, of skipped vacations, and unpaid overtime. My late husband had said once, "Paper keeps your roof standing longer than walls." Now that paper had vanished. By 1 p.m., I was on the phone with the police station. A calm voice answered, slow and routine. "What's the nature of your concern, ma'am?" My son took my property documents. "He's threatening to move into my house." There was a pause. "Is he currently on the premises?" "No, but he said he'll be back." The voice sighed. "Unless there's an active break-in, it's a civil matter. You'll need to talk to a lawyer." "Can someone come check?" He threatened me. "I'm sorry, ma'am. If he returns and forces entry, call us right away." The line clicked dead before I could respond. The calmness in that dispatcher's tone felt colder than any insult my son had thrown. I stared at the phone, then at the envelope still on the table. The room felt smaller now, like it knew how quickly safety can vanish. At 3 p.m., I took the bus downtown. The fare machine swallowed $2 and gave me back silence. I rode past the post office, the grocery store, and finally the lawyer's old building where my husband had once signed our will. The window blinds were shut. A for lease sign hung crooked in the glass. Every place that used to hold certainty now stood empty. I bought a cheap folder from the office supply store, bright blue, and promised myself I'd start over. New copies, new proof. As I paid, I noticed how easily the clerk took my money, how mechanical it was to exchange value. It reminded me how quickly my son had tried to do the same with me, trade family for property, blood for paper. By dusk, the motel room smelled faintly of dust and detergent. I spread the new folder on the bed and started listing everything I could remember: bank accounts, policies, loan numbers. I flipped through old envelopes looking for any trace of my husband's handwriting. Then I found it, an old file labeled Life Policy. Inside, a page outlined the clause he'd mentioned years ago, the one that confirmed me as sole owner of the property after his death. My name was printed clearly beside the words beneficiary. I read it twice before it sank in. Relief came in waves, but fear followed close behind. If they'd taken one document, they could take another. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about erasure, about rewriting the story of who owned what, who mattered. I stayed up past midnight reading that paper over and over under the weak, yellow light of the lamp. It was my last shield, a thin layer of ink between truth and theft. As I finally set it down, I looked toward the locked door. Outside, footsteps echoed in the corridor, just someone passing, but it made me tense all the same. I whispered into the empty room, "You won't take this from me." They thought paper could erase blood. He said it was just paperwork. That's how they always start, the small lies that sound like kindness. I stood at the counter of the same bank I'd trusted for 30 years. The teller, a young woman with careful eyes, looked from the screen to me and back again. "Mrs. Hale," she said quietly, "did you authorize a loan against your property last week?" My throat went dry. "No." "Why?" She hesitated. "Because we have an application. It lists your house as collateral." I leaned closer. "Whose signature?" She turned the monitor slightly. There it was, my name, flowing in neat loops I'd never made. The ink looked clean, confident, but it wasn't mine. "That's not me," I said. The teller swallowed hard. "I thought so. It didn't match your usual style." Something inside me twisted. "Who filed it?" "I can't say directly," she whispered. "But the co-applicant line, well, it lists your son." I blinked, trying to process the words. The air felt thick, like breathing through water. "Are you sure?" "I'm sorry, ma'am. I wish I wasn't." I looked down at my checkbook. The same pen marks, the same loops, all suddenly meaningless. I'd always trusted signatures to hold truth. Now they looked like traps. She printed a copy of the file before anyone could stop her. The paper slid from the printer with a dry hiss. That sound would haunt me later. It felt like a verdict. I asked, "How much did he try to borrow?" "About 80,000, she said quietly. "They said it was for repairs." Repairs. That word stung. "There's nothing broken," I said. When I reached for my wallet to pay the document fee, I realized my hands were shaking. I withdrew another $20, the bills soft and wrinkled. Every small expense now felt like bleeding through paper cuts. Money had become a battlefield, and I was losing on every front. Walking out of the bank, the sun hit my face with a sharp chill. It was early afternoon, the same hour I used to pick him up from school. I could still picture him waving from the sidewalk, clutching his lunchbox, asking what's for dinner. Now that image felt like a cruel memory, proof that love doesn't guarantee loyalty. At the bus stop, I stared at the forged document. My name was there in black and white, but it didn't belong to me anymore. My life was turning into a transaction I hadn't agreed to. A woman sitting nearby asked if I was all right. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what all right even meant anymore. I wanted to tear the page apart to destroy the evidence of betrayal, but instead I folded it carefully and slipped it into my purse. Proof cuts both ways. One day, I'd need it. When I got back to the motel, the hallway smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals. I sat on the bed and spread out my papers, the new blue folder, the receipts, the faded photocopy of my husband's will. I remembered how he used to balance the checkbook every Sunday night. "Numbers don't lie," he'd say. He was wrong. People make them lie. I whispered into the quiet room. So this was never about care. It was about ownership. My phone buzzed. A message from my son. "Stop fighting us. We're trying to help." I stared at the words. Help. Always the same disguise. I typed back, "You forged my name," then deleted it. Sending it would only feed his game. Silence was safer. Outside, cars passed, headlights cutting through the dim light. I thought about the teller, risking her job to hand me that proof. She didn't owe me anything. That small act of courage was the only thing holding me together tonight. I placed the forged document beside my husband's will. 2 pages, one truth, one theft. The contrast between them was almost elegant, like a cruel design. I sat back and watched the light fade through the thin curtains. Somewhere down the hall, a radio played faintly, someone laughing between songs, life going on, oblivious. But for me, something had shifted forever. The world wasn't safe paper and signatures anymore. It was survival in ink. Now I had proof, and no one to trust. He called me ungrateful. It happened outside the church, late on a Sunday afternoon. I'd gone there because I needed silence, or at least something close to it. Inside, the air was heavy with incense, the kind that clings to clothes long after you leave. Father James listened as I told him about the forged signature, the threats, the way my son's voice had turned into something I barely recognized. He didn't interrupt, just nodded slowly and said, "Evil often dresses as duty, Margaret. Don't mistake control for care." His words were calm, but I felt the weight in them. When I stepped into the courtyard, the light was fading. That's when I saw him, leaning against the car, waiting. His face looked tight, the smile practiced. "So this is where you go to gossip about me now?" I stopped a few feet away. "It's called seeking guidance." He scoffed. "You made me look like a criminal." "You forged my name," I said quietly. "That was just paperwork," he snapped. "You're blowing everything out of proportion." I could feel the heat of the incense still caught in my hair. It mixed with the chill coming off the stone walls. The whole place smelled like old prayers and smoke. I wanted to believe faith still lived here somewhere, that maybe I could still reach it. He stepped closer. "You think strangers in there care about you more than your own family?" "They don't want anything from me," I said. "That's not true," he said sharply. "They want your confession. I just want your cooperation." He handed me a folded document. "It's a joint property agreement. Simple, legal. Everyone wins." I didn't touch it. "Who told you to bring this?" He stared at me, voice lowering. "You've made things messy. People are talking. The neighbors, the bank, everyone. Sign it, and we can stop this from going any further." I took a step back. "I'm not signing anything." "Don't make me the enemy," he said. "You owe me that." "I owe you nothing." For a moment, the only sound was the rustling of the trees behind the church. Then he muttered, "Ungrateful." The word hit harder than I expected, not because it was new, but because it was final. He turned and walked away, the paper still in his hand. Inside, Father James was putting away the candles. I stood near the doorway, not sure if I wanted comfort or just proof that I wasn't going mad. "You can't help people who refuse truth," he said softly. "All you can do is draw your line." That night, I sat in my motel room with the rosary he'd given me years ago. I'd kept it near my bed for comfort once. Now it just felt like a question hanging in my hand. Every bead, every prayer sounded hollow when spoken alone. I set it down and reached for the phone. The screen lit up with a new message. "We'll see how long you can live alone." I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I turned the phone face down on the nightstand. The motel smelled faintly of dust and detergent. Nothing holy about it. But it was mine, paid for with what little I had left. Every dollar was a choice now, every bill a wall against them. I whispered to the empty room, "I won't bend." The rosary lay beside the lamp, catching the dim yellow glow. For years, faith had meant forgiveness. Tonight, it meant resolve. I had crossed the line between pleading and standing. Somewhere deep down, I already knew the cost. That was the last time I called him son. Numbers don't lie, but people do. That's what the clerk said when he looked at my papers. I sat across from him in a cramped office filled with the faint hum of machines and the tapping of calculators. The air felt sharp, like it carried a hint of static. Rows of ledgers lined the shelves, the kind that record both truth and theft if you know where to look. He flipped through my statements, brow tightening. "Ma'am, did you make these withdrawals yourself?" I leaned forward. "What withdrawals?" He turned the page and pointed. 3 separate ones, each for $10,000. The signatures match your file. But look here, see the slant? That's not your usual hand. I stared at the print. My name, my handwriting, except it wasn't mine. The strokes were too neat, too rehearsed. I felt my stomach twist. "Who approved them?" He lowered his voice. "Someone linked to your joint account. Same last name." For a long moment, all I could hear was the faint clicking of a keyboard somewhere in the back office. "Can I get copies?" I asked. He nodded. "Officially, I'm supposed to charge a print fee." "That's fine," I said. "How much?" $30. I opened my wallet, counting out small bills. My hand trembled as I handed them over. $30 for the truth. $30 for proof that my son was draining me dry. The irony wasn't lost on me. When he came back with the papers, they were warm from the printer. The ink still smelled faintly chemical, sharp, real. I slid them into my folder and felt the weight of betrayal settle like lead. He hesitated before speaking again. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hale. I see this kind of thing more than I should." I nodded. "You shouldn't have to." "Neither should you," he said quietly. Outside, the afternoon had turned gray. I walked past the glass doors and into the chill. The street smelled faintly of rain. My purse felt heavier than it ever had, though I knew it weighed the same. Proof doesn't take up space. It just presses down harder. At the bus stop, I opened the folder again. The ledger lines ran across the page in perfect order, every number neat, unfeeling. I traced one of them with my finger, thinking of how long it had taken me to build that account. Decades of saving, of clipping coupons, of choosing one dress over another. Now it was nearly gone, bled out in decimals and ink. A woman beside me asked the time. I glanced at my watch. "Almost 5, I said. The kind of hour when light fades and truth starts showing its shadow. When I got on the bus, I sat near the window. The city passed by in streaks of gray and amber. My reflection looked older, harder. I wasn't just the mother who'd been tricked anymore. I was the woman keeping score. I pulled out my calculator and started doing what he never thought I would, adding, comparing, tracing patterns. Every dollar stolen had a date. Every date had a purpose. He'd used my savings to make me dependent, and he'd almost succeeded. The man across the aisle kept glancing over, probably wondering why a woman my age was whispering to herself over numbers. But I wasn't talking to him. I was talking to the paper. To the truth, it finally told me. When the bus jolted to a stop near the motel, I gathered my things and stepped into the cold air. The sky had gone from gray to a muted blue, the kind that hides more than it reveals. I walked to my room and laid the receipts out on the small table by the bed. The motel lamp flickered weakly, casting thin lines of shadow across each page. I added up the totals again, just to be sure. 30,000 gone. My emergency fund, my husband's insurance remainder, the cushion that was supposed to keep me safe after his death, emptied by the one person I'd trusted most. I whispered, "So that's what I was worth." The words didn't feel bitter. They felt precise. I put everything back into the folder and tucked it under the mattress. Tomorrow I'd make copies and store one at the church, maybe another with Father James. I didn't trust banks anymore. I barely trusted walls. Before turning off the lamp, I looked once more at the ledger lines. Each one told a story I hadn't been ready to read. But I was ready now. Every digit was a weapon, and I finally understood how to use them. He stole my piece in decimals and ink. A letter arrived with his lawyer's name. I found it wedged between grocery coupons and a utility bill. The paper was thick, the seal pressed deep, like it wanted to bruise my fingers. I tore it open carefully, half afraid of what truth might come spilling out. Inside was a notice, formal, cold, and final. He'd filed for ownership, citing incapacity. My own son, claiming I was unfit to manage what I'd built. The words blurred for a moment. I'd known humiliation before, but this was a different kind, the kind that comes printed on letterhead. I took the bus downtown the next morning. The city felt harsher at that hour, everything louder than it needed to be. When I reached the legal aid office, the receptionist handed me a numbered ticket. "Someone will call you soon," she said, without looking up. An hour later, a young volunteer waved me in. She looked barely 30, with tired eyes that had already seen too many stories like mine. "Tell me what happened," she said softly. I handed her the envelope. "He's trying to take the house." She read quickly, then looked up. "He's using a medical clause," she said. "Says you're unable to handle financial matters, but he needs proof. This is just intimidation." I let out a shaky breath. "So I'm not already evicted?" "No," she said. "You have rights. The hearing's in 2 weeks. We'll prepare a response." 2 weeks. The phrase stuck like a countdown clock in my mind. She pushed a few forms across the table. "There's a small filing fee, but we can try to get it waived." I nodded. "No, I'll pay." I pulled out my wallet and counted the bills. Just enough left from the necklace I'd pawned the night before. The chain had belonged to my mother. Selling it felt like burying her twice. The volunteer glanced at me. "You don't have to do this alone." "I've been alone longer than he thinks," I said. When I stepped outside, the afternoon light felt thin. I stood on the courthouse steps and watched people rushing past, lawyers, clerks, strangers who'd probably never been betrayed by blood. My fingers brushed the edge of the notice still tucked in my purse. The paper was smooth, but every word on it cut like glass. That evening I made tea in the motel room and spread the documents across the small table. I read them again, slower this time, until the legal terms started making sense. Incapacity. Transfer of property. Hearing to determine authority. It all sounded so neat, as if family could be decided in bullet points. I whispered to myself, they think silence means weakness. I started writing what I'd say if the judge gave me 1 minute. I'd tell the truth the way it happened. No tears, no theatrics, just facts. How I'd worked double shifts for years to pay the mortgage. How I'd trusted him to handle bills while I was grieving. How that trust turned into debt, and that debt into ownership claims. The words came easier than I expected, maybe because they'd been sitting inside me for months, waiting for a place to go. Around 9, the motel hallway went quiet. I could hear the faint buzz of the vending machine outside. I looked over my speech one last time, folded it neatly, and placed it inside the same envelope that had tried to destroy me. If they wanted a courtroom, they'd get a confession. I pressed record before answering the call. The phone rang twice, long enough for my hand to hesitate. The air was heavy, the kind that carries silence like a warning. The mug beside me had gone cold, a faint ring of coffee marking the table. I stared at the record icon glowing faintly red and then swiped to answer. "Finally," he said. His tone was casual, but underneath it ran something sharp. "You've been ignoring my messages." "I've been thinking," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Thinking?" He laughed. "You don't get to think, Mom. Just sign the transfer. The lawyers are waiting." I stayed quiet. The sound of his breath filled the line, impatient, almost trembling. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he said. "They'll declare you incompetent if you keep resisting." That word, declare, hit harder than any threat. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking this time. I wanted him to keep talking, to hang himself with every word. The phone sat between us like a weapon he didn't know I was holding. "Say it again," I said softly. "What?" "That I'm incompetent." "You are," he shouted. "You've lost it. You're living in some fantasy where the world owes you something." I let him go on, every insult, every accusation. His voice cracked once, halfway between rage and guilt, and I caught it, the sound I'd been waiting for. Proof that beneath all the power, he still knew what he was doing was wrong. When the call ended, I sat still. The room buzzed faintly from the old refrigerator. I pressed play. His voice filled the space again, venomous and real. Every word a confession disguised as control. Laura came over that evening. She worked in tech, always had a solution before the problem was finished. "Let me make a copy," she said, plugging in her drive. "Just in case." The file name blinked once before she typed it in. Truth. We listened together. It wasn't just the words. It was how he said them. The pauses, the sneers, the way his tone shifted when he thought I might cry. "He sounds rehearsed," she murmured. "Like he's done this before." I nodded. "He has, just not with a witness." She looked at me carefully. "What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'll keep it safe." Outside, the wind moved against the windows. I could hear it between the quiet parts of the recording, like the house itself was listening. Every threat, every promise, it all belonged to me now. And yet, part of me hesitated. If I played this for others, it would destroy him. The boy I once rocked to sleep, reduced to evidence. Later that night, I sat at the same table, mug refilled this time. I watched the small red light on the recorder blink once before fading. Proof. Cold, mechanical, undeniable. I thought of how easily he had used my trust, my name, my savings, my silence. All of it signed away in words he'd never thought would matter. I whispered, "They matter now." The guilt came after, slow and heavy. Maybe because I knew what was next. Once truth leaves your hands, you can't take it back. Families don't recover from recordings. They break under them. I closed my eyes and saw the drive label glowing in my mind. Truth. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing on a bridge I'd built myself, knowing it had to burn before I could cross. For once, his words belonged to me. I filed my own petition. It felt heavier than it should have, a thin stack of papers held together by a single paperclip. The courthouse smelled like old wood and fear, the kind that seeps into walls after years of arguments and verdicts. I waited for my turn in line, clutching the folder close to my chest. My savings account was nearly empty now. Every signature I'd made in the past month had cost something. When they called my name, I stepped forward. The clerk scanned the first page and raised an eyebrow. "You're contesting an eviction?" "Yes," I said. "And adding a defense submission. It includes evidence." He stamped it once, the seal pressing deep into the page. The sound echoed through the quiet room, the sound of something official, irreversible. My advocate met me by the hallway bench, her tone firm but kind. "You did the right thing. The recording strengthens your case." I nodded. "Does he know yet?" "He will. The mediation notice goes out this afternoon." The word mediation made my stomach tighten. It meant seeing him again. The same boy who used to fall asleep on my lap after nightmares would now sit across from me with a lawyer beside him. At the preliminary session, the room was colder than I expected. He avoided looking at me, his tie too tight, his jaw set. The lawyer did the talking. "My client only wants what's fair. She's not in a condition to manage property or finances." I took a slow breath. "Fair?" I said quietly. "You emptied my account and called that care." The lawyer shifted. "We'll stick to documented statements." "I have those," I said, "and a recording." For a moment, the air changed. Even the mediator's pen stopped moving. My advocate slid a copy of the transcript across the table, the courthouse seal gleaming faintly under the lights. "This was filed this morning," she said. "It will be part of the hearing record." He glanced at the papers, but still didn't look at me. His hands fidgeted once before going still again. That was the first time I'd seen him unsure. As the session continued, I noticed something shift. The lawyer's tone softened. The mediator began to listen, really listen. My words, simple, unpolished, started to matter. Each time I spoke, I could feel the balance tilt, not in revenge, but in recognition. Afterward, my advocate handed me the receipt for the filing fee. "You're officially represented now," she said. "We'll prepare for the hearing next week." I looked at the amount printed at the bottom, $120, the last of what I had left in the bank. It didn't feel like loss this time. It felt like purchase, the price of dignity. Outside, the courthouse steps stretched wide under a pale sky. People passed by without knowing what had just changed inside those walls. I sat on the bench near the exit and looked at the stamped copies in my lap. The ink from the seal had smudged slightly, leaving a faint blue trace on my fingers. A man walking by dropped a coin on the ground. It rolled near my shoe and stopped. I watched it for a second before leaving it there. Some things weren't mine to pick up anymore. When the wind rose, the papers fluttered slightly. I caught them against my chest and whispered, "It's my turn now." Next time, he'd face me under oath. He wouldn't look at me. The courtroom was colder than I remembered, a kind of chill that didn't come from air vents, but from nerves. Rows of benches creaked as people settled in. I sat near the front, my hands folded tight around the folder that had carried every piece of this fight. Across the aisle, he kept his eyes fixed on the table, pretending the papers in front of him were worth studying. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The sound of the gavel landing once cracked through the quiet like the first truth breaking through denial. When they called the case, I rose. My advocate whispered, "Stay calm. Let the evidence speak." I nodded, though my pulse was a drum I couldn't slow down. The clerk brought out the transcript folder. The audio file was queued up. I didn't need to hear it again. I already knew every word by heart. Still, when the first click played through the small speakers, I felt my stomach tighten. His voice filled the room. "Sign the transfer or we'll declare you incompetent." The sound echoed off the wooden walls. Each syllable hit like a hammer. I watched his lawyer's face twist, unsure whether to object or disappear. My son shifted, shoulders rising defensively, but he still wouldn't meet my eyes. "Continue," said the judge. The next line came, "You're not thinking straight, Mom. Just sign it." I heard gasps from the benches behind me. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the tone. The cruelty in it, casual and familiar. For a second, I wasn't in the courtroom anymore. I was back in my kitchen, phone in hand, staring at the same child I'd once taught to tie his shoes. The judge cleared his throat. "This was your son's voice, yes?" I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you confirm that you recorded it yourself?" "Yes, on my phone. No edits, no splices." He looked toward the defense. "Do you contest the authenticity?" The lawyer stood halfway, then sank back down. "No, Your Honor. We'll reserve our comments for later." The judge glanced back at me. "And these withdrawals? Over $30,000? "Yes," I said. "From a joint account. My name was forged on too." For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation. I stared at the gavel on the judge's desk, its handle smooth from use. Truth, I thought, doesn't shout. It just waits its turn. Then came the question that mattered. "Why now, Mrs. Hale? Why take this to court?" I looked up. Because I was raised to believe family meant protection, and I kept that belief until the day it became a weapon against me. He finally looked up then. His eyes found mine, angry, tired, cornered. "You're ruining everything," he muttered under his breath. The judge caught it. "Speak up, son." He looked straight ahead. "She's exaggerating. She's turning everyone against me." "Against you?" I said quietly. "You did that yourself." A few heads turned from the benches behind me. Whispering started. Faint, but different this time. No longer pity. Recognition. People who had doubted me were now watching him. My advocate handed the judge one more document, the notarized defense submission from last week. "The recording is backed by a verified transcript and financial statement, Your Honor. All consistent." The judge nodded, reading the lines slowly. "The court acknowledges receipt. The sound of his pen scratching the paper felt louder than anything else in the room. When the playback ended, the judge leaned back. "We'll adjourn for deliberation, but I'll say this: silence doesn't protect truth. It delays it." He struck the gavel once more. The sound echoed again, sharp, final. For the first time in months, I felt something like air fill my lungs. People began filing out. My son moved quickly toward the door, still refusing to look at me. The lawyer followed behind him, whispering something that sounded more like damage control than comfort. I stayed seated until the benches emptied. My advocate touched my shoulder. "You did it. The power's shifting." I nodded slowly. "It's not power I wanted," I said, "just acknowledgement." As I gathered my folder, I noticed the faint impression of the gavel mark still echoing in my ears. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Truth doesn't shout, it echoes. "The house is yours, Mrs. Hale." The judge's voice landed softly, but the words struck harder than any gavel. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. My fingers brushed against the edge of the bench, steadying myself. The courtroom air felt different, lighter, but also hollow. The clerk handed me a stamped decree, the paper still warm from the press. Its raised seal pressed against my palm, grounding me in reality. He continued, "All prior transfers are void. The ownership is restored. Restitution for the withdrawn funds will follow within 60 days. My advocate leaned close. "It's over," she whispered. I nodded, though over didn't sound right. Winning didn't feel like I thought it would. Across the aisle, my son stood still, eyes on the floor. His wife leaned in, whispering something sharp that made his jaw tighten. He didn't answer. He didn't even look at me. I had prepared myself for anger, excuses, maybe even shame, but not this emptiness. The judge rose and left through the side door. The courtroom began to clear, murmurs rising like the hum of distant wind. Reporters waited near the entrance. One called out, "Mrs. Hale, any comment on the verdict?" I paused at the door. "I just wanted my home back," I said quietly. Then I walked on. Outside, the sunlight felt too bright after the long months of gray halls and legal language. Cameras flashed, microphones hovered, but no one asked what justice really cost. They saw a victory. They didn't see the years of trust that had to burn for it. My advocate handed me the envelope with the certified copy of the ruling. "Keep this safe. You'll need it for the property office." The paper smelled faintly of ink and something sterile, proof of a fight that had taken nearly everything except my will to keep standing. She added, "Restitution should cover what he took, about $30,000, maybe a bit more once the court calculates interest." I let out a breath. "It's not the money that matters." "I know," she said, "but it helps." It was almost noon. Church bells in the distance chimed 12, echoing faintly through the square. People who had once crossed the street to avoid me now stopped, nodded, offered polite words that tried to sound like respect. I saw it in their eyes, guilt mixed with curiosity. Justice changes the way people look at you, but not the way they spoke behind closed doors. One woman, a neighbor I hadn't seen in months, stepped closer. "I heard about the ruling. You must be relieved." "I'm still catching up to it," I said. Relief comes slower than hurt. She squeezed my arm gently, then drifted away. The crowd faded as quickly as it had formed. By the time I reached the courthouse steps, it was just me and the sound of shoes clicking on stone. I looked down at the deed in my hand. My name, mine alone, written clean across the top. The same house where laughter once filled every room, where I had counted pennies to repair a leaking roof, where birthdays turned into arguments when money got tight. Now it was officially mine again. Yet I couldn't shake the thought, ownership isn't the same as belonging. A car door slammed somewhere behind me. My son's voice carried faintly, low and tense. I didn't turn. I'd spent enough years turning toward his words, hoping for warmth, and finding only control. Let him drive away this time. As I walked to the corner, a gust of wind caught the edge of the paper. I gripped it tighter. The embossed seal pressed against my skin like a reminder. Justice can be cold to the touch, but it leaves a mark. I reached the taxi stand. The driver opened the door and smiled. "Home, ma'am?" "Home," I said, almost tasting the word before it left my mouth. The ride back was quiet. Fields passed, signs blurred. My thoughts kept circling the same truth. Justice doesn't restore time. It only returns what's left. When we pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as I remembered, but different somehow. The paint faded, the yard a little wild, the front door still firm against the frame. I stepped out and walked up the path. My hand brushed the doorknob. Cold metal, familiar weight. I turned it slowly and stepped inside. The air carried the faint smell of old wood and dust. A chair still leaned against the kitchen counter, a coffee mug sitting where I'd left it that morning I'd been forced to leave. Nothing had moved, yet everything had changed. I set the court papers on the table. The afternoon light cut across them, tracing the seal. I ran my fingers over the raised edge once more. The silence around me wasn't empty this time. It was clean, earned. Freedom sounds quieter than I imagined. The silence felt heavy, not peaceful. I stood just inside the doorway, the keys still warm from my hand. The air was stale, untouched for too long. Dust floated through the thin stripe of afternoon light that stretched across the living room floor. I could almost see the shape of what used to be. Voices, laughter, footsteps, all gone. The house felt like it was waiting for something that wouldn't return. I set the grocery bag on the table. It wasn't mine. My neighbor, Ruth, had left it earlier that morning. Bread, milk, a few apples, a note tucked on top. "In case you forget to eat," it read. I smiled faintly. She'd always known when words were too much. The paper rustled as I folded it, the sound sharp in the still air. I walked through the hallway, tracing my fingers along the wall. A faint outline showed where pictures once hung. The one of my son at graduation, the one of my husband holding him as a baby. I stopped at the only frame still standing on the mantel. A photo of the three of us, taken before everything broke. My reflection blurred against the glass. For a second, it looked like we were still together. The phone on the counter blinked once. Missed call. His name. Again. No message. He'd called 4 times this week. I hadn't answered any of them. The court had already mailed the restitution check, and I knew the next step was his apology. Not for love, but for relief. I wasn't ready to give him either. The lamp by the window still worked. I turned it on, and the faint yellow glow filled the corner. The light landed on the chair where he used to sit, legs swinging, asking me what was for dinner. I could still hear his voice, layered with time, the echo of a boy long gone. Guilt pressed at the edges of my chest, but it wasn't new. It just had nowhere left to go. I opened a drawer near the kitchen sink and found the old letters. My husband's handwriting, steady, patient, always too careful. I unfolded one, the paper thin from years of being read and refolded. A house only stands when respect lives inside. That line had once sounded like comfort. Now it felt like instruction. I whispered it aloud. When respect lives inside. I sat at the table and looked around. Every object told a piece of the story. The lamp, the photo, the locked bedroom door upstairs that I hadn't opened since the day they left. I wondered if forgiveness could reach through walls, if it could light rooms that had forgotten how to breathe. The phone rang again. Same number. I watched it vibrate against the wood, then fade into silence. I thought about picking it up, about saying what mothers are supposed to say. But what do you tell someone who destroyed your trust and still expects shelter? Ruth knocked gently and peeked in. "I didn't want to intrude," she said. "Just checking if you got the groceries." "I did," I said. "Thank you." She hesitated. "You'll be okay here?" "I think so." Her eyes softened. "He'll realize someday." I smiled, though not out of hope. "Maybe, but realization isn't the same as repair." She nodded, then quietly closed the door behind her. The latch clicked, and the sound stayed longer than her footsteps. I poured myself tea and sat by the lamp. Outside, the evening was slipping toward dusk. I hadn't noticed how fast the day had gone. The clock above the stove ticked gently, one of the few things that had never stopped working, even when everything else had. I took the photo frame and set it beside me. The faces inside smiled back from another life. I didn't hate him. I didn't even want him punished anymore. But the damage had its own memory, and forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about letting him back in. It was about freeing the space he'd taken up inside me. I turned off the phone and faced the quiet. It no longer frightened me. It was just mine again. The lamp flickered once before steadying. I leaned back in the chair, the light soft on the photo frame, the rest of the room fading into calm shadow. I let the stillness stay this time, uncorrected, unfilled. Forgiveness doesn't mean the door reopens. I wrote without expecting a reply. The pen felt heavier than it should have. The kitchen table was cleared for once. No court papers, no receipts, no legal envelopes. Just a single sheet of paper, an envelope, and a cup of tea that had already gone cold. I had spent an hour trying to decide how to start. Dear felt dishonest. Son felt foreign. So I began without either. I wrote what needed saying, not what might be heard. You once asked if I'd lost my mind, I began. I hadn't. I'd just stopped letting you spend it for me. The ink moved slower than my thoughts. Each line felt like a small release. I told him about that morning, the one that started everything, when he'd stood by the doorway, voice sharp, saying, "Didn't you already throw me out?" I'd remembered those words every day since, not as an insult, but as a measure. That was the moment I realized love without respect is just obligation. And I was done living on obligation. Halfway through, my hand cramped. I set the pen down, rubbing my fingers. The afternoon light had dimmed. Outside, the street was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows endings. I looked at the half-written page and smiled faintly. The silence wasn't heavy this time. It was clean. I kept writing. "I don't hate you," I said on paper. "I never will. But I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean stepping back into the same fire. It just means I can walk past it without burning again." The pen scratched lightly against the paper, steady now. I mentioned the money, how it had all been restored by the court. "You took $30,000, but that wasn't what hurt. You took trust, and there's no restitution for that." Then, softer, "Still, I'm letting the debt go, not because you deserve it, but because I do." I signed only my first name. The rest wasn't needed. As I folded the pages, I noticed a faint smear of ink on the edge of my thumb. It looked like a mark of effort more than mistake. I slid the paper into the envelope and pressed it shut, feeling the glue catch under my fingertips. The simple act of sealing it felt final, like closing a door without locking it. The stamp went on next. Small, ordinary, blue. I pressed it down gently and looked at it for a long moment. It struck me how something as fragile as paper could carry so much weight. I'd spent months in court fighting for property, ownership, money, and yet this single letter felt like the truest form of ownership I'd ever had. My voice, unfiltered, unmoved by fear. When I walked to the mailbox, dusk was settling. The street lights flickered on one by one. Ruth waved from her porch. "Evening, Margaret," she said. I waved back, letter in hand. At the corner stood the red metal mailbox, chipped, solid, indifferent. I held the envelope over the slot, hesitating only once. My hand trembled, but not from doubt, from release. "Here," I whispered. "Take it. Let it travel farther than blame ever did." The envelope slid in with a soft sound and disappeared. That was it. No fanfare, no audience, no grand lesson. Just a letter finding its way to someone who might never read it. On the walk home, the air was cool and quiet. A faint smell of rain lingered. I passed the old park where we used to sit on Sundays when money was tight but peace was cheap. I remembered packing sandwiches, counting coins for gas, and thinking love was enough. Maybe it had been then. Back at the house, the lamp still glowed in the corner, steady and warm. I sat down and looked at the space where the letter had been. I didn't feel emptiness. I felt balance, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone else acknowledging it. I poured fresh tea and thought about the line I'd written last. You may never answer, and that's fine. I've already spoken. The phone stayed silent that night. No calls, no messages. I didn't check for them. For the first time, I didn't need to. I didn't need his answer to end the story. This time, I cooked for myself. The smell filled the kitchen before I realized I was humming. A year had passed since the court, since the silence, since the house became something more than a memory. I stood by the stove, stirring the same recipe I'd once made for family dinners. Except now, it was for a different table. The sauce simmered gently, carrying warmth instead of tension. I wasn't cooking to impress anyone. I was cooking because I wanted to eat something good, something mine. The calendar on the wall showed November again, Thanksgiving. Last year, I'd spent it with takeout and silence. This year, I'd signed up to help at the community center downtown. Ruth had told me, they always need extra hands. I said yes before thinking. It felt right. I packed the dish carefully, covered it with foil, and placed it in the back seat. The drive took 10 minutes, though the streets looked different now. Every block reminded me of what I'd rebuilt. One small act of independence at a time. The bank balance was steady again, the house fully paid off. Bills arrived in my name alone. I didn't flinch when I opened them anymore. At the center, the doors were already open, the smell of roasted turkey and baked bread spilling into the cold air. Tables lined the hall, decorated with paper leaves and candles. People moved with easy laughter, serving food, refilling plates, greeting newcomers. Ruth waved me over. "You made it," she said, taking the dish. "Smells amazing." "Old recipe," I said. "First time I've cooked it in a year." She smiled knowingly. "Then it's time." I helped set plates, laid silverware in neat rows. A candle flickered beside each place, its flame small but steady. Across the room, children laughed as they stacked chairs too tall, pretending they were towers. The noise, the motion, the simple kindness, it all pressed gently against the walls I'd built inside myself. When dinner started, I sat beside an older man from the shelter. His hands shook slightly as he poured juice into a paper cup. "You live nearby?" he asked. "Just a few streets over." He nodded. "It's good, being around people again. Feels lighter." "It does," I said. I forgot what that felt like. He smiled faintly. "We all do, until we stop punishing ourselves." That stayed with me. Maybe forgiveness wasn't something you gave once. Maybe it was something you practiced daily, like breathing or paying bills or keeping the lights on. I stood to help serve seconds. Ruth whispered, "You're glowing, you know that?" I laughed softly. Must be the candlelight. When I brought out my dish, she tapped a spoon to her glass. "Everyone, this one's homemade, from Margaret's kitchen." Applause scattered around the room. I set the pan down and stepped back, embarrassed but proud. A young woman took a bite and said, "Whoever taught you to cook deserves a medal." I smiled. Someone once told me, food tastes better when it's shared. As I looked around, I realized how true that was. The hall buzzed with laughter, forks clinking, stories overlapping. No hidden agendas, no cold shoulders, just people filling each other's empty spaces. For a moment, my mind drifted back to his voice. My son's. The one that used to cut through mornings like a knife. "Didn't you already throw me out?" he had shouted. Back then, it was the sound of loss. Now, it was something else. Proof that I had survived it. I whispered the line under my breath. "Yes, I did, and I stayed out too." Ruth caught my eye and raised her glass slightly. "To starting over," she mouthed. I lifted mine in return. By the time dessert came out, the room felt almost sacred, not in silence, but in noise. Children laughing, people thanking each other, small acts of grace, passing around like refills of warmth. I didn't check my phone. I didn't think about who might or might not call. That chapter was written, mailed, and done. When I left, the cold air met my face again, sharper, but alive. I looked back through the glass doors, the tables glowing in the soft candlelight, the laughter still rising. My dish was empty. For once, emptiness didn't mean loss. It meant something had been shared. I locked my car, started the engine, and glanced at my reflection in the window. Peace looked strange on me, but it fit. As I drove home, the house lights waited ahead, steady, warm, patient. The kind of home built on choice, not permission. I was home, finally. And this time, by choice. Did you enjoy this story? Tell me which city you're listening from. I read every comment. If the story touched you, you can support the channel with a super thanks, so I can keep bringing more stories like this every day. Your encouragement really helps. I'd love to hear your thoughts and what moment stayed with you. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's more on the channel as well. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. See you in the next life story. With respect and gratitude,